It's 2:47 a.m. in a small landlocked country in southern Africa. The streets are silent. Not the comforting kind of silence that makes you feel safe, but the tense, almost haunted stillness of a city that's holding its breath. Streetlights buzz faintly, casting pale yellow pools on empty asphalt. The summer air is heavy, sticky enough to cling to your skin, carrying the faint, dry scent of dust mixed with the oily tang of diesel fumes. Most homes are dark, curtains drawn, windows shut. Behind them, people sleep, or at least they try. 2. Unaware that somewhere in the heart of Harare, the night is wide awake. One building in the city center never sleeps. Its windows glow dimly against the black sky, like a stubborn ember in a dying fire. Inside, the air is hotter than it should be at this hour, thick with the metallic taste of ink and machinery. Overhead, fluorescent tubes flicker, buzzing like angry insects. And beneath that sickly light, massive printing presses stand in rows, hulking mechanical beasts with steel jaws and endless appetites. They rumble and groan as they feed on giant rolls of blank paper, swallowing them whole, then spitting them back out covered in the face of a currency that no longer means what it used to. The floor vibrates with every rotation of their rollers. The sound is relentless. Not just loud, but all-consuming, a grinding, mechanical thunder that makes conversation impossible. These machines aren't printing in hundreds. They're not printing in thousands. They're not even stopping at millions. They are churning out billions, trillions. Every single hour. The numbers are so huge, they've stopped feeling like numbers at all. They're abstract now, like scores in some absurd game you can't win. The bills themselves are bright, almost cheerful to look at, crisp stacks of color that should represent security, prosperity, power. Instead, they're more like theater props. They look like money. They feel like money, but they're not worth the paper they're printed on. When the sun crawls over the horizon in just a few hours, the people of Zimbabwe will wake to news. That would sound like a fairy tale anywhere else. Almost every working adult in the country will be a trillionaire, a nation of overnight billionaires, trillionaires, quadrillionaires. On paper, it's the kind of headline that makes you think of champagne fountains and private jets. But here, the reality is crueler. Being a trillionaire doesn't mean a life of mansions and luxury cars. It means, if you're lucky, you might be able to buy lunch. Because this isn't a story about wealth. It's a story about money so worthless, it took a backpack full of it to buy a loaf of bread. A story where shopkeepers weighed bills instead of counting them, where the number printed on your paycheck rose every week, but the food in your pantry shrank. And to understand how an entire nation could be drowning in money yet starving at the same time, we have to go back. In the early 2000s, Zimbabwe was already showing cracks. This was a country that, not long ago, had been the envy of its neighbors. It had rich black soil that could grow almost anything: maize, wheat, tobacco. Its farms fed not only Zimbabwe, but much of southern Africa. Grain trains rolled across borders. Wheat silos stood full. The nickname, the breadbasket of Africa, wasn't an exaggeration. It was fact. People were proud. There was work. There was food. There was dignity. But pride is fragile, and politics is a hungry thing. The government, led by Robert Mugabe, made a move that would change everything. The seizure of thousands of white-owned commercial farms, redistributing them to political allies and loyalists. On paper, it was sold as justice, land returning to the people. To many supporters, it was retribution for decades of colonial exploitation. But to critics, it wasn't reform, it was economic suicide. And almost overnight, the lifeline of the nation snapped. The people who took over the farms often had no experience running them. Irrigation systems broke. Tractors sat idle because there was no fuel or spare parts. Fields went unplanted. Harvested crops rotted in barns because no one knew how to process or store them. The knowledge that had kept the country fed for decades simply vanished. Farmers fled, some to the cities, others to foreign countries entirely. Exports collapsed like a building with its foundation ripped out. The foreign currency that had once flowed in from selling tobacco, maize, and wheat dried up. Without that, the country couldn't afford to import goods it didn't produce. Supermarket shelves began to empty. What food was left became expensive, and then rare. The economy began to deflate, quietly but steadily, like a balloon losing air. People still went to work, but their salaries bought less every month. Businesses still opened their doors, but more often than not, customers walked out empty-handed. And when a government's back is against the wall, when it's staring down unrest, hunger, and political pressure, there's one ancient, dangerous temptation: the printing press. At first, it looked like relief. People had more cash in their pockets. Salaries were raised. Pensions were paid. For a moment, the streets seemed alive again. Markets bustled, buses were full, and there was an illusion of recovery. But it was just that, an illusion. Because, while the printing press can give you money, it can't give you value. The danger crept in quietly. A bag of sugar cost more on Friday than it had on Monday. A loaf of bread doubled in price in a single week. People joked about it at first, then stopped laughing. That was inflation, the slow boil. But Zimbabwe wasn't in a slow boil anymore. The heat was being turned up so fast the water was about to explode out of the pot. This wasn't inflation anymore. This was the opening act of hyperinflation, the kind of economic freefall where prices don't just rise, they detonate. By 2007, the currency's value wasn't just slipping, it was plummeting off a cliff. The Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe was in a desperate race against reality, churning out new notes as if more paper could somehow slow the fall. At first, it was tens of thousands, then hundreds of thousands, then 1 million, 10 million. It was like watching someone keep adding buckets of water to a sinking ship, refusing to notice the hole in the hull. And then, the zeros started multiplying into something surreal. $100 million, 500 million, 1 billion, 10 billion. It no longer even looked like money. The notes were like lottery tickets with ridiculous prize amounts, except here the prize might get you a loaf of bread, if you were quick enough. In just a few years, 100 million Zimbabwean dollars could barely buy a bus ticket. Prices didn't just rise once a week or once a day. They rose by the hour. A bottle of cooking oil might cost $50 million. In the morning, 80 million by lunchtime, and 120 million before dinner. This turned life into a constant sprint. Workers were paid in stacks of cash at noon, fat wads of bills wrapped in elastic bands, and they'd rush out the door straight to the nearest store. Every minute mattered. Wait too long, and the same stack that could buy a bag of flour in the afternoon might not even buy a loaf of bread by sunset. Shops stopped bothering with printed price tags. What was the point? By the time the tag was glued on, it was already outdated. Instead, shopkeepers wrote prices in pencil so they could erase and update them, sometimes several times a day. And if you wanted to buy something expensive, like a television or a refrigerator, the price wasn't just changing. It was being negotiated in real time as both buyer and seller tried to outpace the collapse. It wasn't an economy anymore. It was chaos with receipts. Then came the day that would etch Zimbabwe's name into economic infamy, the release of the $100 trillion note. Just let that sink in. The single largest denomination ever printed for daily use in human history. Not a collector's item. Not a novelty. Real legal tender pulled straight from the presses of the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe. It was a soft green bill, adorned with the usual symbols of national pride. Waterfalls cascading in perfect symmetry, the silhouette of a buffalo, the kind of imagery meant to inspire confidence. But the number printed in the corner was so large it almost looked like a typo. 1, 0, 0, comma, 0, 0, 0, comma, 0, 0, 0, comma, 0, 0, 0, Three more zeros after that. 100 trillion. In your hands, it looked like a golden ticket, something out of a dream. A note that, in any normal country, would represent generational wealth, empires, skyscrapers, islands. But here, it could barely buy 3 eggs. Not cartons, eggs. The first time people saw it, they didn't know how to react. Some stared in disbelief, turning it over and over like it was an alien artifact. Others laughed, the kind of hollow laughter that covers something darker. A few cried quietly, mourning not the money, but what it represented, the collapse of everything they'd once trusted. Almost overnight, millions of Zimbabweans became trillionaires. Families posed for photos clutching the bills, grinning, like lottery winners, holding them fan-style across their chests. It made for good snapshots, good jokes, even good souvenirs for tourists who wanted to take home a piece of history. But deep down, everyone knew the truth. The number on the bill was a joke, and the joke was on them. Daily life had become something that felt ripped straight out of a dark comedy. People didn't just carry money, they lugged it like construction materials. Backpacks bulged with bricks of cash, duffel bags sagged under the weight of endless. Bundles and wheelbarrows rumbled down streets crowded with pedestrians. And no one was flaunting wealth. This wasn't luxury. This was survival. The only way to buy lunch, catch a bus, or pay for a few cooking essentials. And here's the part that seems unbelievable until you see it with your own eyes. Thieves stopped breaking into banks. Why bother with security systems and vaults when the real value was elsewhere? Bread trucks became prime targets. A single loaf was worth more than the cash in most wallets. A man hauling a crate of loaves was essentially carrying a small fortune, enough to spark robberies, street battles, and desperate haggling at intersections. I spoke to one man who described the cruel arithmetic of his day. He left his home with enough cash to cover the bus fare to the factory. He punched in at noon, spent the day working under grinding machines and fluorescent lights, and when he clocked out, he reached into his pocket to pay, only to discover the bus fare had doubled, tripled. He had no choice but to walk for hours under the blazing, dusty sun, his body aching and his spirits heavier than the bag of cash he had carried that morning. Another person shared the story of a restaurant owner who had abandoned printed menus entirely. Prices fluctuated so rapidly that by the time a customer opened the menu, the numbers were already wrong. Instead, he shouted prices verbally, updating them constantly, a live auction in miniature. Diners ate cautiously, counting bills nervously, adjusting what they ordered in real time, knowing that one wrong calculation could leave them short a fortune that, minutes ago, had been worth much more. Life in Zimbabwe had become a relentless game of timing and adaptation, where the rules changed by the hour, and the currency, once a symbol of stability, had become a cruel joke everyone was forced to play. But perhaps the strangest thing was how people adapted. Not with anger or despair, but with an almost instinctive pragmatism. Bartering returned to the streets with a force that no one had predicted. Maize for fuel, bags of sugar for cooking oil, a haircut for a loaf of bread. People traded what they had for what they needed, ignoring the currency that had once ruled their lives because, in the end, it was worthless. Foreign currencies began to seep quietly back into daily life. US dollars, South African rand, small. Stacks of stable bills that could actually buy something became the new standard. Shops posted dual prices, first in Zimbabwean dollars, then in dollars or rands, and people learned to think in foreign denominations, to calculate in a language the old currency could no longer speak. By 2009, the Zimbabwean dollar was officially dead. The government abandoned it entirely, acknowledging what everyone already knew. The money had lost all meaning. And the trillion-dollar bills? They became relics, souvenirs of a time so absurd it seemed like a fever dream. Today, you can buy one on eBay for a few US dollars. Tourists laugh at them, framing them in photo albums and snapping selfies with The notes spread across tables like confetti. For Zimbabweans, though, they are not funny. They are a scar. A reminder of how quickly stability can vanish, how suddenly life can become a constant scramble, how a piece of paper can go from symbol of value to a cruel joke in your hand. And yet, in that adaptation, in bartering, in switching currencies, in learning to survive minute by minute, the country endured stubbornly, defiantly, proving that even when money fails, life somehow goes on. When you hold a $100 trillion bill today, the first thing you notice isn't the weight of wealth. It's the absurdity, the surreal scale of the number printed in ink on paper. But beyond that, it carries a deeper message, a warning, stitched into every fiber of the note. Money only has value if people believe in it. If trust evaporates, even the grandest stacks become meaningless. And in Zimbabwe, that trust vanished almost overnight, leaving behind a currency as fragile as dry autumn leaves. For a few strange, bewildering months, Zimbabwe became a land of trillionaires. Everywhere you looked, people carried fortunes that, on paper, could have bought castles, cars, or continents. Yet in the markets, the truth of life refused to bend to numerical absurdity. The baker, the butcher, the shopkeeper, they held the real power. One loaf of bread, one small bundle of maize, could outvalue stacks of notes. If you didn't have enough, no amount of zeros could save you. You went home empty-handed, stomach growling, reality biting harder than hyperinflation ever could. Because, no matter how many zeros are printed on a piece of paper, no matter how impressive the numbers look when you fan them across a table, you can't eat zeros. They don't fill a stomach. They don't pay for fuel. They don't put a roof over your head. And in that simple, brutal truth lies the lesson. Zimbabwe's trillionaires learned the hardest way. Wealth isn't in the numbers. It's in trust, in goods, in food, in life itself. And when those vanish, all the zeros in the world are just paper.